Right, so I just want to say a small bit about what practical ethics is about and what we're interested in when we're talking about practical ethics. So I'll just move the slide, and if there's any problem moving on to the next slides, do let me know. So I'm just going to move at this stage, and it should hopefully move to the next slide. So tell me if there's any problem. Next slide has come. Thumbs up a bit. Okay, good. So you watch the film Babe, a film in which a lovable pig is saved from the butcher's knife. And this prompts you to think about whether and when you are justified in eating meat, for example. You see images of starving children from distant countries on the television. And this prompts you to reflect on whether and how much you ought to do by way of help. You read about a terminally ill person's legal fight to change the law on euthanasia in the UK. And this prompts you to think about whether and when euthanasia should be permitted and legalized. So when you ask all these type of questions, and when you start thinking about all these things, you are engaging in practical ethics. You are thinking about practical ethics. You are asking practical ethical questions. And you do that every day for even more simple things. So for example, if you try and figure out what you ought to do in a given situation, whether you ought to tell your friend the truth about something, even if it might hurt, you are frequently engaging in practical ethics. My slides are still moving, I hope, for everyone. All is still okay? Good. Okay. So these were just examples of things when you might, day-to-day things that one might think about when one encounters certain situations or reads about certain things that involve us all doing some sort of practical ethical theorizing. So what then do we mean by practical ethics? Hopefully that has gestured towards something of what we mean by it. So I think what we mean really is applying ethics or moral philosophy to practical issues, to real world issues or potentially real world issues, things that may arise in the future. So it is a subdivision of what we call moral philosophy more broadly, and I'll explain a little bit more about what we mean by moral philosophy now. So moral philosophy is the part of philosophy, the subsection of philosophy that's concerned with reflecting upon what's right or what's wrong, or how we should live our lives in relation to others. So all sorts of questions about right and wrong and how we should live our lives. So practical ethics is a subdivision of this. So it is concerned about right and wrong and how we should live our lives in relation to others, but it's concerned about it with respect to particular issues or particular problems, rather than as a general sort of rule. So I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that now in just a moment. When we're talking about moral philosophy, it's commonplace to talk about three subdivisions in moral philosophy, three areas of inquiry, three broad areas. So the first one is known as meta-ethics. And what I mean by meta-ethics is the part of moral philosophy or the part of ethics that's concerned with sort of big picture questions. And what I mean by that is the very, very abstract sort of questions. So things like, what do we mean by morality? What does that mean? Or where do moral claims come from? So things like, if I say something is right or something is wrong, where is that coming from? Is it some sort of tracking some sort of objective truth that this is right or wrong, or is it expressing just my emotion or my intuition that it's right or wrong? And then another meta-ethical question is something like, why be moral? why should I be concerned about morality? Why should I be concerned about doing the right thing? So these are the very abstract sort of questions that sometimes people think, you know, philosophers are busy all the time doing in an ivory tower. And these are quite deeply theoretical questions. However, there's other subdivisions in moral philosophy. And when I'm talking about these subdivisions, I don't mean they don't relate to each other at all. There's a lot of overlap and they inform each other. But another branch of moral philosophy is what we call normative ethics. And normative ethics is concerned with trying to find out general principles or rules about what we ought to do. So using reasoned argument to try and find out, are there any general principles or rules as to what is the morally right thing to do? So let's say whether we should always treat other people as ends and never as a means to an end, or whether we should always act to try and produce the best outcomes or consequences. These might be general principles that we might think would be a good way to live our lives in relation to others. And normative ethics is concerned with trying to find out what principles we should live by generally. Practical ethics, in contrast, is trying to reach a sort of agreement about what we ought to do with specific moral problems. So while normative ethics wants to see if we can find general rules, practical ethicists often look at these cases that are a bit more controversial, or where it isn't so clear whether particular general rules apply in every case, whether there might be a navigation required between different sorts of rules, and whether we need to look at the particular problem and work from the problem up sometimes. So it's a sort of bottom-up sort of methods, I think, in practical ethics. We often look at particular problems where it's not so obvious what the right thing to do is, or that there's ethical issues that arise, whatever we do, and we have to think about, all things considered, what is the best thing to do, or what moral reasons have we for or against doing a particular thing, and how should these moral reasons, let's say, inform policy, if it's something that should have policies surrounding it or regulating it. So that's how practical ethics fits into the broader moral philosophy subdiscipline of philosophy in general. I hope this all makes sense and that you can still hear me okay. Do shout out or let me know if there's any problems seeing or hearing. Okay, so we've already gestured in the first few minutes about three sort of questions that you might be thinking about when you read something on the news, or when you start thinking about what you ought to do in a given situation. So that was gesturing towards the sorts of problems that practical ethicists might be concerned with. But practical ethics is very broad, as we can all imagine, you know, and we can all think that there's loads and loads of problems that we encounter, that ethical problems in various things that we do, both individually and at a collective level. So all I'm going to do now is just gesture towards some areas of interest to practical ethicists, the sort of issues that they're examining and trying to reach agreement upon. So one big area in practical ethics is what's known as bioethics. So it's the part of practical ethics that looks at issues that arise in medicine and biology, or healthcare more generally. So here there's very many issues that arise, some of which are quite controversial and contested. So there's very many ethical issues or problems that arise at the beginning of life. So there's practical ethicists often ask questions and examine reproductive ethics and reproductive decision making. And this is something that Katrina will be talking about, I think, in tomorrow's session. So things about things like the ethical issues that arise when using assisted reproductive technologies, for example. You know, how this should be regulated, what is the morally correct thing to do in using these technologies if we are using them. Also issues related to, let's say, pre-birth genetic testing. So as technologies advance, there's different things that can be done and may in the future be capable of doing related to, let's say, genetic testing for diseases or future disability or other things like that. And practical ethicists often are concerned with examining whether and when things like pre-genetic testing or genetic testing pre-birth, when and whether things like that might be permissible or under what constraints or restrictions. And also then maybe questions about the moral permissibility or otherwise of commercial surrogacy. So as you can see already, even in the beginning of life, there's a whole range of things that people might be concerned with, and ethicists are concerned with examining these questions. You also have end-of-life issues. So things like whether euthanasia, assisted suicide or euthanasia is morally permissible, when, in what circumstances, if it is, and whether it should be legalized. And then also ethical issues that arise with organ donation, and when might it be permissible to donate organs. So if a person has been declared brain dead, is it permissible then that the organs be harvested if they have given consent in advance that this should be the case, if it is a system where consent has been required to opt in. So all these issues about what should be done or how should these things be regulated. There's also questions about how to allocate healthcare resources when we have a finite amount of resources. How do we distribute it fairly? How do we, when we can't give to everything all the time and resources to everything? So this arose also in the context of the pandemic in earlier stages when trying to distribute ventilators and how to manage that and how to make decisions with regard to that. Then ethical issues with the practice of healthcare. So how should doctors, let's say, practice and nurses practice? Whether the importance of confidentiality, the importance of informed consent, and what confidentiality and informed consent mean, what they require, things like that. And also then public health issues. So how or what are the goals of public health, and how should public health be promoted? And what are the limits to the promotion of public health? Who has the authority to give guidance for public health? And is it permissible for governments, let's say, to nudge its citizens toward healthy behaviors? And then, of course, in light of the recent pandemic, also questions about how to manage public health crises. So all these ethical issues arise in practical ethicists. So very busy trying to navigate and hopefully inform policy and make an impact with decisions as regards these things going forward. Another area that practical ethicists work in is the area of animal ethics. And here again, as you probably anticipate, there are very many issues that arise. So let's say ethical issues pertaining to research involving animals, when and whether it's permissible, in what precise circumstances. Questions about the permissibility of eating meat, whether and when it's permissible, whether it's permissible given the facts of factory farming and the intensity of farming in many parts of the world. Questions about the ethics of pet ownership. Is it permissible to keep pets? And if we do keep pets, do we have very special obligations towards them? What are the extent of our duties towards them when we have them under our care? Also, when we have domesticated animals, does that mean that we have certain duties given that we have made them dependent on us? And then questions about wild animal ethics. So given that we know there's immense suffering going on in nature for wild animals, do we have duties to intervene? When do we? Do we have duties to intervene when we are the cause of the suffering? Or have we broader duties even than that? So again, these are some questions, but there's a whole host of other issues that one can engage with when thinking about practical ethics. So climate change is an obvious one. What are our duties with respect to that? Have we responsibilities towards future generations to ensure that we preserve the planet and a livable climate for them, and our duties to animals and plants and nature as well? What should we do with the problem of global poverty? Do we have individual duties to help? If we can do so at very little cost to ourselves? Questions about war. So, is war ever justified? Sometimes can one side at least be justified in going to war? And when, if ever, is a war just? Or what are the just conditions for going to war? Or the just conditions within war? Just ways of behaving within war, if one is in war. Questions about the morality or otherwise of criminal punishment. What justifies our punishing people, that is inflicting burdens on them or intentional harming? What justifies our doing that, given that we usually think that it's wrong to harm others? So what justifies our current practices, given that very many people think that they are justified, trying to find out what justifies or what limits our punishment of others? And then also ethics surrounding artificial intelligence. So things like, if we do create sentient seeming robots, artificial intelligence, how should we treat them? What is their status? And then questions, let's say, about responsibility in AI or liability. So if we have self-driving cars, who is responsible if anything goes wrong, or who is responsible for things there? So very many issues. So I hope that's just giving us a taste. So this week and the other Bitesize Ethics sessions, there will be a taste of more discussion of more specific problems. So today was our introduction. Tomorrow, Katrina is talking about reproductive decision making. So some of the things we gestured towards earlier. The following day, Muriel is talking about authenticity and newer interventions. So questions about whether if we use interventions which exert direct effects on our brain to change certain aspects of ourselves, does that make us less authentic? Does that make us less true to ourselves or not? Then Ben is talking about contested decisions in healthcare. So things about how to allocate resources or how to fairly allocate resources in healthcare, amongst other things. And then on Friday, Roger is talking about hedonism, which is a theory of well-being, what makes a life good for someone, and discussing that and then seeing how hedonism and ideas of pleasure enter into very many issues or discussions in practical ethics. So that is the plan for the week going forward. And today was meant to just explain what we mean by practical ethics and to give an indication of the breadth of topics that concern practical ethicists, and hopefully inspire some further thought amongst yourselves about things that you might find interesting. It probably has become clear that in practical ethics, very many things that are discussed are very controversial, contested, and often have significant emotional resonance from very many people. So in the business of practical ethics, it is always very important to remain respectful of others' views, even if you disagree. So that's something that is very, very common within practical ethics, that even when people are presenting vastly different views, to try and see the strengths and to be charitable to other people's views, and to always engage in discussion with respect for them. So it's very different sometimes to how things operate in the wider world, when sometimes on the internet people frequently just engage in shouting matches. So when it comes to practical ethics, that tends not to be the case, and it's actually something we strive not to do. So I hope that that was of interest, and I'm happy to hear people's thoughts or talk about any questions that might have occurred to you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Sorry, I'm just struggling to turn my mic and video on. I think we're there. Thanks very much. That was really helpful whistle-stop tour. I'm glad you mentioned the issues of how contentious some of these things are, because you know, it can be very difficult to keep a sort of an academic and level head when talking about some of these things. I'm just going to invite questions, thoughts, comments from the group. Please do turn your microphones on, join in. If you want to put your comments in the chat or your questions in the chat, we can read those out for you. Oh, we've got a question from Sam.
Thank you, Emma. I wondered if I could ask a fairly broad question about the study of practical ethics. And going back to your first slide on the 3 branches, I'm currently doing philosophy with OUDCE and doing the Cert HE in philosophy, and hope to go on to the MST in practical ethics. So in terms of underpinning philosophical baseline knowledge to prepare for the narrower study of practical ethics, I'm obviously hoovering up all the ethics modules on that course, but I'm about to select modules for next year. I'm looking at philosophy of mind and theory of knowledge as probably being an essential underpinning. Would you recommend metaphysics as well? Is metaphysics an essential underpinning to go on and do practical ethics?
So I don't mean to disparage metaphysics at all, but I don't think it's essential. No, I don't think it's essential. It's obviously interesting in its own right, and there's certainly things that might inform the sort of things you'd be interested in discussing, but no, it wouldn't be a prerequisite or something that you need to engage in practical ethics. No, I don't think so. So a lot of you know, it'll be much simpler if you don't have a particular reason that you want to study metaphysics to pursue practical ethics and go back and look at certain things about metaphysics if you thought you needed to as you go. I don't think you would need a extensive grounding in it for practical ethics.
Thank you.
Great. Have we got any other questions for Emma at all? No? Well, while you're thinking, Emma, I might just ask you to say a little bit more about the policy involvement of practical ethicists. You mentioned that earlier on in the talk, and obviously that's a really significant way of getting practical ethics and the consideration of those topics out into the public domain. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you think that's important, say, for government or for companies or something like that, and how we can get involved.
Okay.
Can I ask something?
Yeah, perfect.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm Liz, and
I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm interested in ethics on psychotherapy. So that would be practical ethics as well?
Yeah, it would. It would definitely be practical ethics. It's yes, so it would involve both kind of medical or healthcare ethics, and also just professional ethics more generally. So yes, very much so. Yes, it would be still practical ethics.
Okay, thanks.
So Liz,
We also have a question in from Montserrat, actually, which says very nicely, great presentation, Emma. What book reading materials would you recommend as a starting point for beginners? That's a great question. Okay.
So yes, so one book that is quite well known that gives is called Practical Ethics, is Practical Ethics by Peter Singer, and in that book he discusses some issues in medical ethics and some issues about global poverty and climate and things like that, and animals. There's also the Oxford Handbook for Practical Ethics, which is an anthology with essays with different people. And there are other bioethics introductory texts, but I can't think of the names. What would it, Liz, would it be okay if I compile a bigger list of names and we email it to participants afterwards?
Absolutely, that sounds great. Yes, thanks.
Okay. So yes, I'll think of a few introductory texts that I get the names right. And about the policy questions. So yeah, I think when practical ethicists are engaging in research, I do think that they want their research to hopefully at some point in the future, though it might be far away, because it might to make a difference. So they want to try and work or be part of the effort to help us navigate certain problems, and some problems are those that inform our laws and our regulations. So sometimes when practical ethicists, let's say, for example, during the pandemic, there were very many people at the Uehiro Centre here and elsewhere writing about issues related to how we should proceed during the pandemic with regard to vaccinations and restrictions and things like that, and what's the best thing to do ethically, or how to navigate the competing interests and concerns. And these outputs by researchers were also presented sometimes to government or to those who have policy making power to try and inform decisions. And that's happening all the time in other areas, not just something as urgent in terms of time as the pandemic. So yes, so practical ethicists produce academic work, and they do public engagement, and they write general articles for audiences, but they also sometimes produce documents intended for perusal and consideration by those with policy-making power.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, thanks, Emma. Yeah, it is really important to make sure that those views are all heard and taken into account. Do we have any more questions or comments for Emma? Yeah. No, it's a big topic, so I can imagine that there's a lot going through people's heads just now.
Can I ask a daft lad question, I guess? Sorry, this is Peter Haver speaking. Emma, do practical ethics have to have a link back to normative ethics in some way? I think why I'm asking the question is, where does a practical ethicist's view of something just turn into an opinion?
Yeah,
how do you distinguish between an ethical stance and my view?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So yeah, so I do think it links back to normative ethics in the sense that when practical ethicists are arguing for a view, they usually try and draw upon principles that might be identified in normative ethics. So it's not so much the case that they, let's say, pick a theory. So they decide, I am a consequentialist about morality. By this, I mean that I, let's say, think that the best action is the one that produces the best consequences, roughly. And let's say if one says that, suppose one says, oh, I'm a consequentialist about morality. Therefore, in every practical problem, I will apply my consequentialist view. That isn't the way it works in that sense. So it's more that practical ethicists, as I was kind of saying earlier, that they work from the bottom up. So they look at the problem and they think of the moral reasons one might have for pursuing one course of action over another, and try and then through reasoned argument, drawing on, so the moral reasons that they identify would be reasons that come up in normative ethics. So they would be using theory to help navigate, but rather than starting from theory and fitting every problem then into it. So, but yes, it is certainly informed by normative ethical theorizing, because it isn't very useful, and it's certainly not very good practical ethics to just, let's say, produce a paper saying that I think this, and only I think this, and not be able to back it up with some sort of reasoned argument. Now, there might be times that you reach a point where you say, here I have the intuition that this might be the case, but others may differ. So there might be points that as yet we reach a sort of impasse if people differ with their intuitions, but there may be certain things that we can reach agreement on if we apply, if we identify and apply principles that are relevant. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions or anything anyone would like to ask or share?
Perhaps me, just very shortly and very basic. So, so what is like the interrelationship within the normative ethics and law? No, because they don't always fit together. No?
Okay, so yeah, so that's a good question as well. So yes, that sometimes we think that certain things are things that are morally right, what we should do, and sometimes the law doesn't fully align with that. So there might be illegal to do something that we think should not be illegal, that actually would be morally permissible, and sometimes there might be things that we're morally allowed to do, or just that we think that we're legally allowed to do, that some people might argue we shouldn't be. So yeah, I think that law is to some degree expected to or meant to track morality. So it's meant to be informed by the outputs of normative ethics or practical ethics. But there is still a difference in that sometimes something might be accepted as morally permissible, but there might be other reasons why one might think that we shouldn't allow it legally. So there might be practical reasons that it might be the case that it should be something that should be allowed, but we would be afraid that legalizing it would have unexpected or side effects and consequences. Someone might think then that there was a reason for a difference in the law versus the moral arguments. But also then practical ethics and normative ethics together sometimes can make a case for changes in law. So if there's moral arguments to be made and successful ones about something that people have a right to that isn't currently, let's say, recognized as a right, it might be a reason for advocating change in existing legal arrangements, or if there is something that is morally important that isn't currently protected, not just rights but other things that isn't protected by law, or there aren't sufficient regulations surrounding it, and then practical ethicists and normative ethicists have a case to try and inform law. So I think it does inform law, but there's sometimes when it comes apart. There are very many things that might be morally important that aren't protected or addressed by law, and there are sometimes things that might be morally correct or morally permissible at the moral level, but that the law sometimes there might be other reasons why law might not recognize them as legal rights or things like that. If that makes sense. You could give an example there actually, just so there's a lot of questions, let's say, about the topic of euthanasia, and so there are some people who might argue that morally euthanasia might be permissible. Now there's some that would still disagree and argue the other way, but some might agree morally that it's permissible, and these same people might still think that there are arguments against legalizing. because they might be worried about, let's say, undue pressure placed on people to pursue euthanasia if, let's say, they were old and unwell. So that sometimes it's a controversial topic, but sometimes that's where some people might see morality and law coming apart. Of course, not everyone would, but that's some people can argue for the moral permissibility of something and still face some sort of restrictions on what they think the law should do. Sam.
Grab my microphone a bit nearer. I don't know if it will help. Do you have a good starting point or introductory text for whether the law ought to reflect morality?
Okay.
Because that's a slightly separate question about how closely should the law reflect morality. Do you have a good sort of introductory text for that you can maybe add to our reading?
Yeah, I'll have a think. I can't think of one straight away, but I can think of individual articles discussing that. But I'll have a look. There probably is some textbook as well, and I'll have a think.
Papers, if they're available online for us to read. Thank you.
I think another question is it, Tammy B. How important are our own beliefs in our study of moral philosophy and practical ethics? Are they considered an asset or hindrance to the academic process? Well, I think that they're certainly a starting point. So certainly things that you believe or you have intuitions about are a starting point for investigation. So they give you ideas of what you're interested in examining. I think that good academic work would require that if you try and find reasons that support your belief and you fail to, or you find reasons that conflict and undermine your belief, then you probably should change your belief or at least modify it. So I think that, yes, that the academic process should help one refine one's belief and sometimes reject them if they turn out to be inconsistent or conflict with other things that one has better support for. But there's certainly a starting point for investigation. And if we didn't have certain beliefs, values, and intuitions, we probably wouldn't be motivated to do any of this work. So. Any other thoughts or questions that anyone would like to ask or share?
Julio has posted a message, but for some reason it's come to me as a direct message.
Okay.
To what extent do practical ethics researchers get involved in policy making, activism, or collaborations with public and private organisations?
Okay, yeah, so they do quite a bit. So actually a lot of practical ethicists' work is quite collaborative. So it's often collaborative with other disciplines. So let's say if they're working on something that requires medical knowledge or various scientific bodies of knowledge, there will be collaboration. And also lawyers, so there's often interdisciplinary collaboration in producing work. And then there are very many practical ethicists who do actually work, let's say, in the think tanks, which might sometimes produce outputs to inform policy, but then also even within governmental institutions in